Let's go ahead and move into our 1910s decade. This one starts us out with a photo that's actually relevant to our Radium Girls book. It's the story of war. This says, two sounds defined the decade. First, there was the clatter of machines for transport, manufacture, machines that changed America forever. Then came the thunder of guns as war engulfed the world. D.W. Griffith steered film away from melodrama and slapstick. Siegfried relied on the tried and true formula of giving his audience an eyeful. And this is an example of the eyeful that he was giving. On stage and screen, glorious excess, it says. Irving Berlin wrote that a pretty girl is like a melody. But a lot of pretty girls, that is a spectacle people will pay to see. Ziegfeld, former manager of a sideshow, put his insight to work, and thus was born Broadway's best-loved revue. Out of the vulgar leg show, Siegfried has fashioned a thing of grace and beauty, cooed a reviewer in 1907. So, talking about camera angles, cross-cutting, close-ups, and wide shots, that these early advances were changing film from being something that was either slapstick or melodrama to now it was beginning to come into a more mature existence. A killer at sea and one at home. When RMS Titanic scraped its hull on an iceberg and sank into the North Atlantic on April 14th, 1912, the disaster grabbed headlines and the national consciousness like none before it. The passenger list on the world's largest and most luxurious ship, 1/6 of a mile long with a price tag of $7.5 million, mirrored the social order. Each person's station in life would decide his or her chance of escaping death. Hyped as unsinkable, the Titanic left England for New York with only enough lifeboats for half the ship's passengers, whose lives were worth saving. It was this deadly calculation that gripped the public. All but one of the 50 children who died had been traveling in steerage. 3/4 of those in third class drowned, while nearly 2/3 of those in first class were saved, among them the wife of industrialist John J. Astor. Today, the story of the 1,500 dead still tugs at our memory, but nearly forgotten is the far greater loss of life caused by a worldwide influenza epidemic that began in 1918. Yeah, it was nearly forgotten until the pandemic of 2020. And then we all revived it and talked about the one 100 years ago. But this photo shows a flu victim being treated at that time with sheets up around them. They're wearing masks. The view is actually quite familiar, isn't it? That was the influenza epidemic of 1918. The 500 employees of the Triangle Shirtwaist Company were about to head home on March 25th, 1911, when a fire broke out in the cutting room. Feeding on piled scraps of cloth, flames raced through the factory, which occupied the top 3 stories of a Manhattan loft building. Workmen on the 8th floor got out fast, as did executives on the 10th. But on the 9th floor, the bosses had locked the exits to keep the seamstresses, mostly Jewish and Italian immigrants, ages 15 to 13, at their machines. Dozens crowded onto the rickety fire escape, but it collapsed under their weight. Others plunged to their death trying to slide down the freight elevator cable. By the time fire trucks arrived with ladders that reached only to the 6th floor, desperate women were leaping from the windows. I learned a new sound. A more horrible sound than description can picture, one reporter wrote. It was the thud of a speeding, living body on a stone sidewalk. The final toll was 146. The Triangle conflagration galvanized the drive for better working conditions, but it also showed how little workers' lives were worth in an age of no-holds-barred capitalism. The factory owners were acquitted of manslaughter charges, and though the families of 23 victims won a lawsuit, the judge awarded them just $75 apiece. Oh my goodness. Oh gosh, these are the bodies. Oh my goodness. Two silent giants meet. This is a fascinating photograph. It's Charlie Chaplin and Helen Keller. It says they were among the most celebrated people in America when they met in Hollywood in 1918. Keller, who was a renowned author and lecturer, had gone west that year to appear in a movie. Blind and deaf from the age of 19 months, she had learned to speak, read, and write with the help of teacher Anne Sullivan, who became her constant companion. With Sullivan's assistance, Keller had graduated from Radcliffe College. Now she was traveling the continent. While in California, she and Sullivan dined with Chaplin, who had made his signature picture, The Tramp, 3 years earlier. And what did the movie star and the Hollywood newcomers talk about? Him, mostly, and his troubled marriage to young actress Mildred Harris. Though unable to see his flickering image, Keller took pleasure in the films, proving no more immune to Chaplin's charms than millions of others. It says Keller would listen to a speaker by placing her fingers on that person's lips and voice box, as she does here with Chaplin. Isn't that fascinating? That's a very interesting picture, very beautiful. The war to end all wars. In November 1916, Woodrow Wilson was reelected on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." 4 months later, after German U-boats sank 3 U.S. ships and intelligence agents intercepted a German telegram proposing an alliance with Mexico, Wilson committed his nation to history's first global conflict, already 3 years old. The world must be made safe for democracy, the president declared. The job, leaders in Congress said, would take 6 weeks. In fact, it took 2 years until November 1918. Along the way, a peacetime army of 200,000 was transformed into a fighting force nearly 5 million strong. U.S. troops helped break the war's long stalemate. Their morale crumbling, Germans revolted, and the guns soon fell silent. U.S. combat losses were relatively light, 53,000 dead, compared with Europe's millions. But the Doughboys had seen horrors that changed them forever. Wartime industry had given blacks and women new opportunities and new impatience with second-class citizenship. In fact, many Americans sought new freedoms and new kinds of fun. They would find both in the 1920s. So here we have photos of a man in front of a factory worsted weight mechanism. It says he worked at the world's largest woolen worsted mills in the world. So that's a giant set of factories. Here we have Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller. It says Bill Gates has been attacked as a monopolist in a similar way to John D. Rockefeller. Big boss men. We get a mention of labor relations, and we have some quotes from people during these years. I will read a few because I see some names that were interesting. So far as I can now recall, this is Booker T. Washington in 1901. So far as I can now recall, the first knowledge that I got of the fact that we were slaves and the freedom of the slaves was being discussed was early one morning before day, when I was awakened by my mother, kneeling over her children and fervently praying that Lincoln and his armies might be successful, and that one day she and her children might be free. John Muir, a personal, someone that I admire, says, "Any fool can destroy trees. They cannot run away. And if they could, they would still be destroyed, chased, and hunted down as long as fun or a dollar could be got out of their bark hides, branching horns, or magnificent bold backbones. Through all the wonderful, eventful centuries since Christ's time, and long before that, God has cared for these trees, saved them from drought, disease, avalanches, and 1,000 straining, leveling tempests and floods. But he cannot save them from fools. Only Uncle Sam can do that." That was his appeal for our national parks in 1901. We'll end with this, it seems appropriate. Upton Sinclair in the jungle. "The men upon the floor were going about their work. Neither squeals of hogs nor tears of visitors made any difference to them. One by one they hooked up the hogs, and one by one with a swift stroke they slit their throats. There was a long line of hogs with squeals and lifeblood ebbing away, until at last each vanished with a splash into a huge vat of boiling water. It was all so very businesslike that one watched it, fascinated. It was pork making by machinery, pork making by applied mathematics." That's from The Jungle in 1906. So that's our look at the 1900s through the 1919s, or the 19-teens in quotes. And the rest of the photography that we looked at was from the 1910s. Next time we will get into the 1920s. I'm enjoying this book. I think it's really helpful for getting into the mood of the Radium Girls. This last one gets us right up to the time period that the Radium Girls were operating in. So that's particularly interesting to me.